So good morning and welcome everyone to this webinar from Pharma Medic and Triducive. It's titled Medical Affairs 3.0, A Discipline Comes of Age. My name is Nick Williams. I'm managing partner at Triducive and I'll be chairing today's session. You won't see them, but the technical leads on today's production are Anna Foster and Bethan James, who will be helping to ensure smooth running of the webinar today. So if it goes well, it'll be all because of them. So thank you, Anna and Bethan, in advance. We have a great agenda today for you, which includes time for your participation and questions. And I promise that we will finish today by 9 o'clock. Before we introduce our speakers, let's go over a few housekeeping items to ensure that you enjoy the experience today. So firstly, please could we ask that you remain on mute throughout to ensure we maintain good audio quality for you. Could you make sure therefore that mobiles are on silent as well? Today's webinar is being recorded and that's to help make sure that we can provide a version of the slides and the recording, the speakers' recordings with that after the session. We definitely encourage your questions and participation, comments as well. And we'd ask that you submit those into the chat throughout the session. I'll aim to keep an eye on those and to address as many of these as we can during the Q&A session. I might even be mischievous and chuck a couple of them into the speakers as, through their session if they're very, very good questions, which I'm sure they will be. If we don't manage to answer all of the questions this morning, we'll look to follow up as soon as we can afterwards as well. For the best enjoyment of the event, we suggest that you view today's meeting in side-by-side mode. You can change this using the view widget at the top right-hand corner of your screen. And in that way, you'll see the speakers along the right-hand side and the slide to the left of them. And finally, many of you will be pleased to know that we're providing CPD certificates following the event, which you may find useful. So please let us know if you would want to receive those. So let's get started with some introductions. Our two speakers today are Malcolm Barratt-Johnson, Managing Director of Pharma Medic, who provide adaptable medical support for startups, mid to late stage pharmaceutical and biotech companies and academic centres. And Tim Warren, my colleague and co-managing partner at Triducive, who design and deliver evidence-based campaigns to help see better decisions actioned across healthcare. Malcolm is a doctor who's built upon his initial work with the NHS with incredibly extensive experience in advising government, industry and academic centres around the areas of drug development and commercialisation. He's held a number of important and eminent positions at bodies such as Royal Society of Medicine and Royal Society of Biology. Recently, Malcolm was invited to join King's College London as lecturer on the MSc course on drug development science. Good morning, Malcolm.
Good morning, Nick. Good morning, Tim, actually.
And Tim, of course, began his career working for Diabetes UK, where he played a leading role in the fundraising for the charity's research programme. He subsequently moved into the pharmaceutical industry, where he built a really successful career in commercial leadership across a number of top 10 global organisations. Tim is founder of Triducive and now also a trustee of Diabetes UK and a keen advocate for the work they do to identify and ensure access to new innovations in this area. Good morning, Tim.
Morning, Nick. Nice to see you. Morning, Malcolm. Morning, everyone.
So the conversation this morning is focused on the evolving and increasingly strategic role of medical affairs within pharma and life sciences businesses. We hope to discuss this coming of age of medical affairs, what we mean by this, and maybe offer some perspectives for your consideration and to respond to, and also provide some thoughts on an approach towards developing evidence that can have early and powerful impact. My own experience working with many fantastic medical affairs advisors, as we're often called, over the more than 20 years in industry, leads me to conclude that the discipline now brings so much more than advice to the table for marketing or market access colleagues to digest and reflect in their communication activities. They are increasingly leading on the communication that organizations have with customers and on the development of the communication strategies themselves. So with that in mind, Malcolm, could I hand over to you to get us started?
Nick, that's very kind of you, and thank you for the introduction, and welcome to everybody on the call this morning. And just like to reiterate my thanks as well to Tim and Nick for bringing this together very much with Beth and Anna on our side and the whole team. It's been a very interesting and a lovely joint effort. So as Nick said, we're going to be examining what medical affairs is going forward, we hope, and what it could be, and the way that people can actually renegotiate that sort of setup as we've got it. By the way, it's very nice to see so many friends and colleagues on the call this morning. So I've called this Beyond the Job Bag because, as many of you know, and you do on a daily basis, and you have over many years looked at job bags and all the stuff that goes with it. Whether they're called job bags anymore is a moot point. It's changed from the physical things that we knew many years ago to the unphysical digitization. If you look at medical affairs, I found this diagram, I thought it was quite cogent. Medical affairs is a little bit like a big pen. What do I mean by that? Well, big pens have not changed actually from 1955, really, between 1985 to 2021. But, they've been developed in their own sort of ways. And I think med affairs has also changed quite radically over that time. But the core to it hasn't. We put the patient at the center. We make sure that things run smoothly for the sake of patients. And that's very, very much at the fore. But the only constant really is change. And so we have to change. We have to adapt. We have to look at the ecosystem which we're working. And that is now amending itself. It's changing. And I think what we're seeing is a repositioning of medical affairs, as Nick said, as being much more central to the way that every organization and biotech actually works. What does a medical affairs team actually do? And I think we all think we know that, either from the marketing side, the sales side, or indeed from the medical side. We all have a view on it, but what do we do? Next slide. So I put a few ideas up here, and I put this like a roadmap of this. So this is what I think presently may be, some of us think. So we link scientific and clinical results to patient outcomes. Absolutely crucial. And I think that's something which will continue very much to the fore. We have to make sure that link exists. We gain insights, especially things like from the MSL teams, to make sure that the return on investment is there and we create a strong competitive edge within our company, but compared to other companies and other competitors. We gather feedback on the product's marketing potential, and we make sure the patient's needs are fulfilled with that from the earliest stages. And very much we add value to a product and its development and life cycle. But should there be more? How is that going to develop? How is that going to change? So next slide. It's all about this guy. Very much, it's got to be the patient. The patient has got to be at the center of everything we do and everything we think. But how is that going to be changed over the coming years? Next slide. Now, this is quite an interesting thing. This is from a few years ago now. This is from 2016. This is from the Bain's outputs. Now, I think many of us realize, or we think, that the marketing teams have very much driven this since the 2000s and much earlier. And we look at brand reputation, and we look at the way that sales and marketing have changed. These are what both American and European physicians look in terms of their prescribing. So what influences make them prescribe a certain medicine? Now, down the bottom here, we've got safety. And that, of course, is absolutely crucial. We want to make sure that a medicine is safe, it does what it says, and it can have an output which we can depend upon. But to have to get to that point where they prescribe your medicine or company's medicine over and above the competitors, what are they looking at? Now, what this showed is that sales reps are actually fairly low on that pecking order. This comes to about 31, 37%, both European and America. But what they really do look at are patient outcomes, and they also look at real world evidence. They look at RWE, which we're going to come back to later. Now, that's important because it means that the medical affairs groups are absolutely key. So in spite of our marketing colleagues thinking that the brand strategy is vitally important, which it is, and looking at the way that that is marketed, actually from the sales rep side, these two things are actually far more critical. In fact, they're well over double what we're looking at in terms of brand. Next slide, please. Again, this is a fairly old slide, but it actually shows something quite important. So if for the last decade, things have changed. So this shows is a way that people have looked at from the physician side. These are non-surgeons, so we're not looking at our surgical colleagues. You've probably got a slightly different set of values because they look at devices and stuff like that a bit more. It's looking at a 3-year change from the mid-2010s, how they viewed this. So it's moved away from sales reps, it's moved away from pharmacy colleagues, and it's moved very much into academic journals, but also it's moved into key opinion leaders' views, and in terms of what the medical education is in terms of its whole galaxy of outputs, whether it be conferences and the way that data is presented to the physicians. Now, that is where medical affairs has got obviously a central role. Medical affairs comes into the area where you want to look at the totality of therapy. Next slide, please. So we have to think beyond the product. So in spite of the fact that in many companies, we're still looking at product-based views in terms of medical affairs and in terms of marketing, my view is that we need to move away from that. We need to look at the way that our actions encompass a much wider therapeutic context. As time has gone on, so especially things like oncology, we've got immunotherapies based on top of chemotherapy. This is a very confusing area. It's very confusing to me, but it's even confusing to our colleagues at the coalface in clinical medicine to explain the way and contextualize what those therapies do in terms of the newer therapies compared to what's been treating and how patients have been treated so far is vitally important. This is very key to the way that patients are being treated and thinking about things. And we've got to put, as I said, the patient very central. With basically science getting more complex, we're looking at not just the products, we're not just looking at the contextual way that therapies are being given, but also the way that patients are being affected by that in the wider setting. We've really got to provide meaningful interpretation to data and place that in front of a physician saying, this is what it may mean in totality. Next slide, please. So we've got to really improve the patient experience and the outcomes. To do that, we've got to look at the evidence generation in a much more innovative way. We've got to accelerate access to treatments, which is increasingly difficult when you've got such a crowded marketplace with increasing levels of science on top of that. We've got to transform and personalize medical engagement. There's no point just having, in my view, a detail aid which basically goes in one direction. We tried very hard, I think, over the last few years to make these things a lot more individualistic. But we got to think, okay, the patient's an individual based on genomics and proteomics, and we got to think how that fits in to the way they will be treated. But overriding all this, we've really got to think differently in terms of medical leadership. Next slide, please. What I put down here is a few core deliverables I think are vitally important to med affairs. Number one, we have to take much more of a leadership role. And that means in terms of driving forward evidence generation across a whole range of stuff. Health economics is something, certainly in my time in industry, has come from pretty well nowhere to something which is absolutely crucial. You can't really launch a drug now without nice economics appraisals being an absolutely central part of your endpoints from the very start of development. That is different, but we have to lead that and show that. We have to articulate very clearly what the economic values are and how these fit into the overall therapy of a drug, of the treatment of a certain condition. We need to ensure, and I think this is the most crucial thing, that the right patients get the right treatment at the right time. Very easy phrase to say, but incredibly difficult, as you all know, to get that right. This sounds a little bit derogatory, I suppose, to my colleagues on the clinical side, but we have to upgrade physician and patient decision-making. We tried that over many years, especially on the patient side, because we had things coming out of Europe like UParty, which put the emphasis much more back on patients and the way they think about their own treatments and taking it basically into their own hands again. But we have to tailor that information. There's so much information that's coming down. It's very difficult to sort that out. And the other thing very much, and I think this is key to everything, we need to provide strategic medical leadership to the organization, steering resources in perhaps a slightly different way. And I'm not being derogatory again to my marketing and sales colleagues at all, but I think we have to think much more clearly about what the physician needs, what patients need, and what the medical impact of certain ways of looking at a drug and therapy will be. Next slide, please. How do we achieve this, though? That's crucial. It's all very well saying that. We need to very much be embracing innovative technologies and looking at the way we use the healthcare systems and actually producing guidelines and pathways with clinical medicine in the UK, NHS, but in many other systems too. We need to say what the guidelines should be and not just be a fairly passive group coming in with our own product ideas. That needs to change in terms of the whole industry, I feel. We need to provide data insights much more based on the use of population genetics. Again, one thing which I think many of us have seen is that we quite often become quite insular, whether it be in the UK or in Europe or in one sector. But people are not like that. We need to supply the genomic information which we gain from the whole world. There's no point having a marketing team in Germany or Belgium or Russia or South America, which is independent of that thinking. We need to think also of using AI much more to actually targeting the needs of individual customers. We can look at data in a much more stratified way now. We should use that. We need to leverage real-world data, real-world evidence. This is something which many of you know has been at the very much at the forefront of new regulatory processes like ILAP, and also the way the MHRA, indeed the FDA, are thinking. In fact, only a month and a half ago, 2 months ago, both organizations produced new outputs in terms of real-world evidence. And this leads in very much to the way we think about evidence and the need for evidence and the way to think about that and present it. We need to articulate very clearly the clinical and economic outputs and values for patients. We need to understand much more better and actually present those within our companies and globally, the use of sharing schemes, risk sharing schemes to save for payment. There's no point just chucking stuff out there and say, this is what it's going to cost. How are we going to get patients to adhere to it? If we fail on that, we need to basically pay and be part of that discussion. And we need to build the voice of the patient as being central to our business, not something we think about as part of the process, but not key. Next slide, please. So where does this lead us with medical affairs? Well, for many, many years, research and development has been very much part of every company. It has to be. It's a key of what we're doing. But it's in many companies that's been farmed off to a large extent by bigger companies like Curvia, where these R&D groups are coming in, they're supplying the data setups, but we're using the data within the company. We've got commercial and market access, which are incredibly important to us to take things forward. But medical affairs is becoming much more, as Nick said at the beginning, a key part. It's one of the triumvirates of the stool. We should be leading this. We should be highly strategic in our thinking, not just being led down that road. We need to have much more use of in-market data generation. How is it affecting us on a day-by-day basis? And we need in-market monitoring, which we do, but we can use that more effectively, I think. We can't become what we've been for a long time, a supportive function. That's not derogatory to P teams, but it's much more important. So how do we get that within our medical groups? How do we develop that as medical directors? Well, at the base, this is very similar to what a lot of you might have recognized as the marketing application, really, the classical pyramid of data and whatever. We as a medical affairs function have, of course, technical skills, scientific, digital analytics, compliance, etc. But on the top of that, we have to have adaptive leadership. Customer engagement, yes, we do that. Entrepreneurship, we don't do so well. That's not something that companies, certainly bigger or middle-sized general companies, do very well for the medical teams. We need learning agility. We need to take on different sorts of people. We need people who are data scientists, translators, look at data in a global way. We need, and we have to actually push for our own ability to do strategic vision. How do we do that? Looking at data again. We need a much greater sense of business acumen, I feel. Something which we do as consultants and entrepreneurial people, but we may have to engender that much more in our day-to-day companies and the people we're working with. Next slide, please. The other thing is we should learn much more from other sectors. As many of you know, the powerhouse of medical affairs will only come from looking at the way that other sectors and other industries have done it. Pharmacovigilance, as going back, and the pharmacovigilance systems we had were actually in the early days, in the late 90s and mid-90s, developed in part from the aircraft industry. We looked at the safety systems on board. The MHRA did that quite categorically, we looked at things like Virgin and we tried to work out how we could run it better in the late 90s based on that system. I've got a Tesla down there or any other electric vehicle, again, talking to the way that medical affairs has got to take on a much more therapeutic range and rather than data centered. If you look at motoring and cars, they come from a fairly sort of mundane, passive way, a supportive function to us driving them, to basically looking in at the whole totality of data and taking it on board. And that's quite interesting. If you look at things also like data, you look at call centers and whatever, again, they're bringing data in from all different directions, analyzing that using AI and saying, okay, what does that data mean? Not just in terms of the actual data, but in the totality. They're compartmentalizing it and say, what does this mean for our customers? We have to learn from these sectors and say, what techniques do they develop which we could have? Next slide, please. So who are the winners? How are we going to win this in terms of bringing medical affairs and our companies, our clients to the fore? Personal opinion. We need to position the science much better. We need to understand our science, which a lot of us do very well, an ability to combine analyses of that, to interpret disparate groups of data and the interactions with stakeholders in that context. We need to position the patient voice, very central to everything we do. We need to have a use and application of global data sets, not so much individual insular. We need to think therapeutics, I think, instead of product. It's device, drug, and data. Devices are now key to everything we do. We now have to look at devices as part of our therapy. Data is part of that. The drug is part of it, but not the totality. Marketing of medical affairs has to lead brand strategy, something I think my marketing colleagues would probably have a little bit of an issue with. Medical affairs leading. But I think we do. We really do have to think, where do we add value? And I would say as well that we need more pharma CEOs and biotech CEOs who are out of medical affairs. We got a few key ones, but we haven't got enough. We need to bring these people on. It's not the fault of any company. It's our responsibility. We need to show we're entrepreneurial and we can think outside the box. Next slide, please. I don't know if that's the end of my bit.
I think, Malcolm, that brings
that's the end of my bit.
Right. It is, but thank you. And Malcolm, it's clear that you are a really passionate advocate for medical affairs and the role they have and could have in future. It'd be great to see the questions the group have for you later on. So please do add your questions for Malcolm in the chat. In the meantime, Malcolm, here's one from me. I wonder, what do you think is the biggest barrier to some of the bolder aspects in the vision you described for medical affairs becoming the norm?
Yeah, Nick, thank you. I think the biggest thing is actually our own mentality as medics and people working in the medical affairs group. And, it's not just medical doctors, it's pharmacists, scientists, data analytics, as we said. We need to really change our mind thinking. We need to think as entrepreneurs. We need to think, how do we drive the business? We really ought to take the business as being part of ourselves, saying, how do we drive this forward? And that is something that only can come from us and our leadership. We need to say, we are business people, as well as medics, as well as pharmacists, as well as data and information scientists. And that is crucial. If we don't do that, why should anybody take us seriously? Quite right, So I think that's the biggest barrier, as far as I see it, our own thinking set. We've always put the patient in the middle, I hope we do, but I think we need to take the lead on that.
Thank you, Malcolm. That's a really interesting point. So as this role of medical affairs evolves, and an increasingly important aspect to the focus, as you touched on there, Malcolm, is on in-market data generation and real-world evidence and how we think about data, I suppose, in a broader sense. We wanted to put a spotlight on one method, particularly of generating this real-world data that can be adapted and applied to many medical communication challenges. Isn't that right, Tim?
It is, very much. Thank you, Nick. And thank you, Malcolm, for that perspective. My name, as Nick has mentioned, is Tim Warren, and I work at Traducip, and we've had the pleasure of working with Malcolm and his organisation to a great extent in the past. Indeed, what we wanted to explore was really to understand how we can anticipate appreciate, and plan for success, learning from the views of others, people within the customer base, the positions, the therapeutic areas that present themselves. Malcolm made a really key point, and one that won't be new to any of you, I suspect, but the amount of data that is available, whether it's real life, whether it's empiric data, is absolutely stunning. And the amount of communication that this requires is consistent and ever growing. And I'm sure a number of you, many of you, I think, will sign off the job bags associated with this in previous roles, if not current roles. But whatever data is available in whatever form, the one constant, the one thing that we've noticed as being absolutely true is that everyone has an opinion on it. It's either good data, poorly powered. It didn't reach its endpoints. Its secondary endpoints were insufficient. The cohort wasn't big enough. The population profile wasn't right. It didn't reflect a real life setting. All these issues are exhibited in the various opinions that exist, positive or negative, concordant or conflicting. But everyone has a view on that, which can shape their appreciation, their opportunity about how to get the right treatment to the right patient at the right time for the right reason. The point was also made earlier that healthcare is continuing to advance, and it's a very exciting field that we're all very fortunate to work within. But as it gathers pace, these new innovations are coming through, it is creating ambiguity. You think about CAR-T and some of the genomic medicines that are coming through, the personalized and individualized medicines that are coming through, the increase and advent of new therapeutics for oncology. The ambiguity at the clinical coalface is massive. There are confusions, there is a lack of clarity, and there is opinion that, as I say, may be conflicting and challenging people's confidence to be able to embark upon what may the future be. This ambiguity is also amplified by budget holders and non-clinical audiences that many medical affairs teams have to engage with and have to support the communications and the education with. What we've recognised and what we've experienced is the fact that expert opinion remains necessary. I'm not a medic, and I've asked many of my medical colleagues in the past, Malcolm included, what is medicine? Is it a science or is it an art? And the answer has been varied from various responses, but the commonality has cropped up that it is a combination between being a science and an art. It's appreciating the data, the opportunity, but having the scientific rigor to be able to employ the art, the clinical experience, to meet the needs of that individual patient that's sat in front of them within that clinical setting. Expert opinion is necessary in medical practice. The Delphi methodology is a very robust way to facilitate a more scientific approach to getting the right answer, rather arrogantly, where there is a lack of empiric data or where there is a weight of opinion that needs to be challenged, understood, and communicated. A number of trials and trial settings are open to criticism. Study designs aren't suitable for all tasks, all objectives, all opportunities. And even those at the top of the hierarchy of evidence, those randomized controlled trials, have weaknesses as well as strengths, but no research method is flawless. That led me to look very crudely at Pubmed and to understand where medics, medical affairs, medical practitioners get their information from. And a very crude Pubmed search, just using the terms RCT, the evidence at the top of the hierarchy, and a very crude term, consensus, demonstrated these results. Over 18,000 consensus-based studies were published and available by peer review on Pubmed, compared to only 4,500 RCTs. It kind of showed that more opinion-based evidence was published during that time period, appreciating that it's a very crude search term. But it does sort of support the fact that whilst there is good, robust, available quality data out there, clinical trial setting, it is supported, complemented, or challenged by the views of experts, consensus or otherwise. Delphi Consensus is something we have a lot of experience in, and I'm sure you guys around the virtual table are aware of it and familiar with it. You'll recognise that Delphi rather arrogantly, as I said, is the right way to get the answer to a question, the right answer, where there is a lack of empiric data that exists. It is a robust way to get that answer through the structuring of information, understanding, learning, anticipating, and feeding back the information in a structured manner. It relies on the role of an independent but knowledgeable facilitator to reduce any bias, to reduce any preconceived ideas or undue influence. It relies on the anonymity of participants so that people are free and able to contribute their views and their opinions in a way that is safe, that is non-threatening, that isn't governed by an ivory tower or the influence of someone that may be deemed as being a very highly esteemed key expert in that particular area. It relies on regular feedback, so there's an element of continual learning, understanding, adaptation. And the quality of the data set that's offered through this methodology allows itself for peer review publication and provides level 4 evidence, according to the hierarchy of evidence, that contributes to the thinking, the evidence base. It informs fellow experts about the views, current thinking, and what the future may offer in any given therapeutic area. Malcolm highlighted a roadmap earlier on, and it struck me how relevant this kind of approach is compared to his view of where medical affairs sits and where it should sit moving forward. The Delphi Consensus system is robust, it is credible, it's widely accepted. It's applied a lot within the healthcare setting, and we know from experience that during the outbreak of the COVID pandemic, there was no precedence, there was no data, there was no empiric evidence to suggest what needed to be done and the benefits of doing something or not. So the Department of Health and the experts relied very much on the views and opinions of experts and employed a lot of Delphi-based consensus to inform their initial decisions about what activities needed to be taken in order to serve public health needs. The methodology is widely used by academia, by healthcare institutions, by professional bodies, and by clinical audiences in order to inform answers that need to be asked but may not be able to be achieved through other means of research. There is a standard process that should be employed to deliver this, to meet the rigor of editors, reviewers, peer reviewers, and to obviously do what we need to do to deliver the Delphi process in a robust, structured, methodical, and scientifically based approach. We need to work hard, and Triducive does, to understand what is the research question that needs answering. What are the key performance indicators? How do we know when we've achieved consensus and expert opinion can be achieved and recognised? Who are the people that can inform that? Who can help shape that? Who can help initiate that? And who can include their responses to that to make a more rounded and amplified understanding of the issue at hand? That involves working closely with steering groups through virtual means in the world in which we now currently operate, but to do that in a way that structures and provides regular feedback and information flows in a facilitated, structured, and somewhat anonymous approach. Once we've got the statements that are initially there to be tested to answer the research question, we can share that with a wide group of peers, fellow people working in this clinical or therapeutic area, payers, nurses, GPs, specialists, patient groups, institutions, government bodies, whoever is relevant to provide an information and an opinion on the research question that's being asked. And from that, very robustly validate, understand, and amplify that opinion, that weight of opinion that may or may not exist based on the research problem that's put there to test. It offers level 4 evidence, so it absolutely contributes to the evidence base, to the thinking, to shaping the thoughts and the innovations that medical affairs and the industry is keen to engender, stimulate, understand, and explore. We've seen it applied in a range of different areas. It is used across different industries, not just healthcare, and building on Malcolm's point about learning from other industries. Delphi-based thinking is used by the farming, the agricultural industry, petrochemicals, the environmental industry, education. It's used a lot within IT and digital settings to understand needs, wants, and opportunities for an idea that doesn't have any precedence behind it. And as I've already highlighted, used a great deal within the global healthcare market. It can be used to establish unmet need, to clarify the opportunity, the needs of certain cohorts, the identification of patient groups, where the unmet needs may be, how well recognised they are, and what steps need to be put in place to mitigate and address those unmet needs. It can be used to encourage optimal approaches. What is best practice? And again, building on Malcolm's earlier slides, the real world utility of a medicine is very important and very relevant within clinical practice, and cannot really be answered within a more false and academic setting of a randomized controlled trial. The reality to understand and encourage optimal approaches can certainly be informed by opinion thinking, by opinion learning, and by developing areas of consensus and commonality that can and should be employed within clinical practice. And of course, this can then be used to support new policy, guidelines, advanced applications for funding, new pathways, etc., etc. It can be used because it provides a level of confidence. It isn't the views or opinions of a few people or certain people sitting in a certain ivory tower at the top of the clinical tree. It's really a collective and collaborative approach of people that are involved, able and willing to express an opinion that is far more representative of that therapeutic area and the people that care, inform, or pay for that care for those patients. Delphi is a very robust real-world methodology to address certain research questions. And I won't read this slide to you, but I wanted to make the point that it isn't appropriate for everything, but it is appropriate for a lot of things. And I've highlighted some of those things in terms of defining unmet needs, patient cohorts, developing pathways, best practice, identifying and mitigating barriers to access within clinical practice, or even through budgetary considerations, establishing new practice, new guidelines, and exploring how practical applications to the evidence base can and should be applied within a real-world clinical setting where a real-world patient is involved. The work lends itself very nicely to publication, and we're very fortunate to work with eminent healthcare professionals and experts to develop these publications. But with the medical writing that we have available, we've seen a lot of publications that you'd be able to find on Pubmed. We've had publications accepted in the BMJ, in very reputable medical journals, and they're journals that are exploring current and future thinking about what could and should change, and most importantly, why, to ensure the right treatment is offered to the right patient at the right time. The reason for sharing this isn't really to be big-headed or to brag or boast or anything like that, but really to recognise that there is a need from within the market, from the editors, from the audiences, from fellow healthcare professionals, to understand the views and opinions of others, their peers, to understand what is being advocated for, what is the current thinking, what is the real application of these medicines within clinical practice. And that appetite from the journals and the editors lends itself to further communication, understanding, confidence and clarity that can address some of the ambiguity that is driven by the advances that we're seeing within the healthcare market. So by way of conclusion, Delphi is a suitable option to address some of those areas we feel we've experienced, we've seen, and any situation that requires a deeper and better understanding, a better process of reaching decisions through the views and experts of peers and people that are at that coalface, as it were. It establishes better relationships. It engenders trust, openness, and confidence between some of the decisions that are made nationally or even at a local level. And as a consequence of that, people feel more compelled to deliver, to implement, to act upon that. They feel less alone in some of the choices, the decisions, or the reservations they may have. But of course, any problem, any research need, any opportunity needs to be assessed appropriately to ensure the feasibility can be expertly approached. But in conclusion, and Nick, I'll hand back to you, expert opinion is an important component of any medicine, any evidence-based medicine. It remains a necessary component as part of that platform to determine the answers to clinical questions that emerge once a medicine, once a new way, once a different way of doing things to meet patient needs is recognised.
Thank you, Tim. Really clear, and I think stimulating too, but perhaps as your colleague, I'm a little bit biased. We have a couple of questions in already, but to give the group a little bit more time to consider what they'd like to ask of either Malcolm or Tim, perhaps Tim, I can put one of mine to you at the moment. So I was going to ask the slide that you shared, which highlighted the number of expert opinion-led pieces versus RCTs in 2021. Was the global pandemic at all responsible for this? And if so, why do you think that was?
It's a good question, Nick. I suspect, and I did look at some of the data from previous years, and it certainly seemed particularly high in 2021. I think, due to the pandemic, patient recruitment, et cetera, for things like RCTs and clinical trials, as we all know, stalled. But there were still research questions that needed to be answered. And I do wonder whether COVID had an impact on the number of consensus-based and thinking-based studies, as opposed to those that involved and required input from patients on placebo or active treatment. But whatever year you look back on, there is still a greater emphasis on consensus, on opinion, on expert-led views than there is on empiric RCTs. But of course, let's not forget, RCTs are far more costly and timely to organise, to manage, to deliver, etc., etc. As you well know, we can deliver Delphi Consensus within as little as 6 months. It's a far swifter and a much lower cost opportunity to answering specific questions, if applicable.
Thanks, Tim. Maybe Malcolm, I could ask you a question. Maybe going back to that point about, I guess, the role for medical affairs, and you stopped short of saying that maybe pharma companies could be stopping investing in sales teams and relying on medical affairs, if you like. But do you see, I mean, maybe this is quite a provocative question, but could you see a point where particularly big pharma, I guess, stop investing in sales teams and rely more exclusively on medical affairs to drive clinical engagement?
Well, I think, Nick, no, thank you. I think we already are. I think we already drastically have seen that. I think we haven't seen the end game of this point in history because of COVID, and basically the teams haven't fully gone back to face-to-face. Completely, no, I don't think so. I think there was always going to be a role for marketing and sales, and I'd say that as well in the company we have, because I've worked with both of you guys, and I think marketing is crucial. You can't get a product or you can't get a device anywhere unless you market it correctly, and marketing's crucial. I think medical science liaison people are becoming more and more important to every company. Everywhere you go, it's impossible to see GPs. It's impossible for patients to see GPs, let alone reps. And, if you look at the hospital environment now, all the barriers we have to get in, you have to have sort of pre-warning to go to a hospital, you have to see this person or that person. It's not a matter of wandering in and seeing, Dr. Blogs or anything any longer. So medical scientific liaisons are crucial because they explain in a much wider setting. I think the trouble is, or one of the problems is, that we have to also make clear that medical is not marketing and sales per se. When you work for a company, as we all know, you are in a role of promotion, whatever you want or whatever you think. You are, because you're aligned with that company's values, its ideas going forward. But we can't be regarded as salespeople. And I'm afraid some companies that I work with, and maybe you see, and a lot of our colleagues see as well, do have that slight thinking that we can replace some of our salespeople with MSLs. We give them a slightly different glean, we polish them up, we show them that they can think in a different way, we can give them data, nice packages, and we can push them out and say, right, you're going to push the data, but at the same time, you're going to collect everything, and you've got not a sales aid, but you've got a package of materials which will push the case a bit more. I think we have to change that. We have to say, no, we are there to support patients, yes, and we're there to support the company, but we're also there to help our clinicians' friends to make the right judgment. On occasion, that may not be the product that the company wants to sell or promote, but it's got to be focused on that. And in the long run, that will always pay off. people want people to tell them the truth, and they want to know what the actual therapy should be and how it fits into the way they should be thinking. And that will always come back to help you. Sometimes, though, because the way companies have been set up, and I would say that this is something overhanging from the 1980s and 1970s, maybe even 1960s, that's not all the way that companies' objectives are done. It's done that we should have a sales target. We should have a marketing review. What is medical contributing? Something we hear time and time again. What is the return on investment of medical? And we've always had that discussion. What does medical do in terms of return on investment? And it's very difficult. If you're a med director, how can you say it? Everybody, I think, on the call is going to have a view on ROI in medical. We've never been able to prove it. And I think MSLs particularly, we've got cars, they've got pensions, they've got national insurance payments. How do you justify that when you haven't got maybe bricks and sales targets for those bricks? And 1, 2, 3 MSLs might cover a whole country. So very bit provocative, but don't know. Our marketing sales have got an absolute crucial. I'm not saying we should take over completely, but I think.
But I guess it links back to your point earlier about the leadership role that medical affairs can take in, I guess, shifting the perceptions and communication goals, if you like, of organizations based on that wider sort of set of needs that we know that our customers have now.
I think we've only got ourselves to blame if blame should be any part of it. I think we need to have more confidence in the ability of medical to lead, to be entrepreneurial, and we need to make sure that we're part of that story. All too often, even now, you do get marketing teams saying this is the way it's going to be. Basically, we're going to give you a little pot of money. And in actually 1 or 2 cases, as many of us may know, even the big boys, the big companies, the big ladies, they say, actually, we're not going to give medical any money. We're basically going to get you to ask us for some money to do something that you might want to do. And then we'll make a decision as to whether it may be worth it for the brand. Yeah, but that's our fault. We need to say no. But we need our medical directors, our medical leaders to say that. But we do need our senior management teams to understand where medical sits and what we should add to the mix.
Absolutely. Thank you, Malcolm. So a question from Rita in the chat. I think, Malcolm, you've already responded to her being as efficient as you are, but it'd be good to kind of share it with everyone. So Rita asks, systematic reviews and meta-analyses seem to have been building their space at the top of the sort of pyramid, I guess, the evidence hierarchy. What's the opinion, I guess, of the panel, so Malcolm and Tim, I'd invite, on that to complement real-world evidence? So how do you see it sitting, with real-world evidence, I guess the historically gold standard study types? Malcolm, perhaps I can go to you again first.
No, that's fine. I did drop a very quick message back to Rita. Now, they're obviously not, on the other side of the table. I think that they add to it. Systematic reviews are by their nature reviews. As data is added to it, then you change it. You change the data as it comes along. It's a crucial part of every system. So real-world evidence, at the moment I'm involved in 2 studies, and they keep saying real-world evidence. This is a real-world evidence way of looking at stuff. It is, but we've been doing real-world evidence for thousands of years. If a patient took something and they died, didn't work very well. If they survived, it was always a medic that had cured them. Usually made no difference at all. But anyway, that's the way we looked at it. So real-world evidence adds to the totality of data, the way that the analyses and the way that the reviews change over that time will amend itself. And also it will change in terms of what we understand from genomics, proteomics. We look at conditions. Quite often, basically, what we are taught at med school or pharmacy school. We're taught that Addison's disease was one condition that had these symptomologies, and that was what Saturday Addison's was, based on some chap's name back in the 19th century. We now know that all these conditions are a subset of genomics. They could consist of 20, 30 different subgroups. We need to look at that in totality. And the reviewing and spreading that out can be something that quite often we as individual companies or groups can't do. We have to depend, as very much Tim said, on looking at things in a different way, taking the data, applying things like AI, machine learning, as I keep getting told, in saying, okay, split the data out more. As data comes in for world evidence, how should that amend it? Tim, would that be your take? Or
I would echo that, absolutely. And I mean, Nick, to answer the question, I think there's an absolute place for it. And we've seen it, increase up the hierarchy of evidence. I think any of this, whether it's Delphi, whether it's real world studies, whether it's RCTs, it's got to go back to the objective. What is it that needs to be researched and substantiated as a consequence of that? And if that methodology is the appropriate one, absolutely. I think there's a lot of robustness behind those systematic reviews. I think they're a good way of building and iterating on the current evidence base and looking forward. I think that they've got a very valid place from that perspective. I think medical affairs, and I haven't worked in medical affairs. I spent, a number of years working in the industry, but on the more commercial side. But I think it's got a fantastic opportunity to really shape, to understand, to anticipate the needs of the medical markets, the customers that the medical teams engage with. I appreciate, Malcolm, that they're not sales representatives, and nor should they be, but anyone that works within the industry is seen as being, there to increase the shareholder value and hit certain targets, whether they're sales targets or otherwise.
No,
but I think that what really struck me out of all this is your slide that you presented with the roadmap. I really think this is a very compelling and important step. And Nick, whether that used to be a role of sales teams could be up for debate. Whether it used to be the role of MSLs, Malcolm, you'll be able to inform me. The role of MSLs moving forward, it's clear here what Malcolm has shared in that is what it should be doing. And I think having a process, whether it's through research, conversations, engagement, to gather feedback, to learn from insights, to ask the right questions that are aligned to the corporate objectives, the shareholder value, the vision of the company, but in a way that serves their patients in the best way, is a very exciting place for MSLs and medical affairs to be working within.
Absolutely. And I think that's kind of echoed by a few comments in the chat, and B, kind of, I think goes back to something, Malcolm, you were saying earlier, which about return on investment, and saying that the value of medical affairs will always be difficult to measure. But if we do become, and I guess demonstrate we're becoming strategic and entrepreneurial, it becomes self-evident, because I guess people see the value a little bit more immediately from those conversations.
Nick, we've seen that from our own experience. We've seen a number of approaches from clients that involve both medical and the marketing leads to address these 4 points that Malcolm's illustrated here through the application of Delphi. I mean, it ticks all these boxes, but if opinion is so important and so fundamental within medical practice, based on the evidence base, don't get me wrong, then surely the client, the pharmaceutical company, the medical affairs teams, even the marketeers need to understand and anticipate those needs in the most robust way possible to ensure the right things are being done for the right patient at the right time, for the right reasons, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's a very exciting landscape for medical affairs moving forward.
So I'm conscious we're coming up towards 9 o'clock. I want to just acknowledge a couple of the comments that have come in that seem to be sort of talking towards a similar sort of theme, which is almost a value proposition for medical affairs as a potentially a topic for the next talk. Thank you, Alan, for that. And I guess linked to that, perhaps one for you, Malcolm, the final perhaps say, besides increasing confidence, how do we suggest that we better communicate our impact as a medical team? And maybe that is talking about a value proposition for medical affairs in a nutshell, but what else would you offer, Malcolm?
I think we just need to change our mindset on the medical side slightly. And I think in a lot of comments here as well, Sunny's mentioned about looking at the data and looking at the way that health tech giants are communicating data. It's a difficult one. We have to say that we are scientists, we are medics, true, but we have to say that we are part of the entrepreneurship of science going forward. You know, big companies have got their agendas. The days of the blockbuster, in my view, are coming to an end. They're not completely over, but they're coming to an end. The biotechs depends very much on medics. They depend on medical input, science, data, analytics. As Sunny's saying, the way that we're collecting data from social media as well. The biotechs, if you go back to the 50s, and I'm not quite from the 50s, but I'm getting a bit on that way, they actually were set up in the main by medics and pharmacists and scientists. I would hate to say it, especially against my marketing colleagues, which I've got a huge opinion for, but we need to bring that back and say that science is now leading it, and in small niche areas. You can't sell an orphan drug, a genomic drug, in terms of a marketing application. We need to become entrepreneurial. We need to think in terms of being business people as well as good scientists. But we also need to be data savvy. We need to understand the new technologies. Alan was talking about AI, machine. Another topic, Alan, I have got one or two examples of that.
We've got lots of topics for
lots of topics.
I
think we just need to be more entrepreneurial, Nick, and we need to think more clearly. But my thanks again to everybody for attending today, and also to both you, Nick, and Tim for doing such a wonderful job.
Thank you, Malcolm. Thank you, Tim. I'd like to close very swiftly and just thank everybody for your questions, your participation, and your thoughts. We'll make sure, if you require them, we'll get the CPD certificates to you. I hope you found this morning's session interesting, helpful, and look forward to welcoming you back to a future event, hopefully. Have a great day, and goodbye for now.